I was in a hotel suite with her best friend, laughing over champagne, while she stood alone in their penthouse, 7 months pregnant, surrounded by candles she had lit for him, a Thanksgiving dinner she had spent all day preparing, and a phone still warm from the conversation she was never supposed to hear. She didn't scream, she didn't call him, she didn't break a single dish. She simply walked to the table, set the divorce papers beside his empty chair, and whispered into the silence, "Happy Thanksgiving, Valentino." If that was you, 7 months pregnant, standing in the home you built together, hearing the man you love choose her, what would you have done? Before we go further, if stories like this hit you somewhere deep, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button, drop your city or country in the comments below so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Let's begin. The dinner had taken Elena Moretti 11 hours to prepare. Not because she was trying to impress anyone, not because she needed to prove something. She had done it because she believed, really, truly believed, in the stubborn and exhausting way that only a woman who still loves someone despite every reason not to can believe, that this was the night things would change. She had told herself that all week. She repeated it while she chopped vegetables at 6 in the morning, her back aching in that low, grinding way it had been aching for the past 3 weeks. She said it again while she stood at the stove stirring gravy at noon, one hand resting unconsciously on the curve of her stomach the way it always did now. Like her body had developed a new reflex it hadn't asked permission for. She even said it quietly to herself around 4 in the afternoon when Valentino texted to say he was running late, not asking, just announcing, as he had been doing more and more lately. And she had read the message twice, put the phone face down on the counter, and kept cooking. He had promised her this Thanksgiving would be different. He hadn't promised it with flowers or grand gestures. Valentino Moretti wasn't built for those kinds of promises. He had promised it the way he did everything, directly, with his eyes steady on hers, his voice low, like a contract being signed. He'd said, "This year, family first. I mean it, Elena." And she had nodded, and she had believed him, because 7 years of marriage had taught her that when Valentino said something in that particular tone, he usually meant it. She had made herself forget all the times he'd used that same tone, and hadn't. By 5 o'clock, the penthouse on this 42nd floor smelled like roasted herbs and butter and the expensive candles she'd bought from that small shop on the Upper West Side that Vivian had shown her. That thought moved through her mind, and she let it go. Vivian was coming tomorrow for leftover pie and coffee. There would be time to think about Vivian tomorrow. At 6 o'clock, she called Valentino. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She stood in the kitchen holding the phone, her thumb hovering over the screen, and made the conscious decision not to overthink it. He was busy. He was always busy. That was what she had married. Not just the man, but the machine around him, the constant low hum of obligation and danger and responsibility that never fully switched off, not even at 2 in the morning, not even on holidays, not even now that she was 7 months along and the doctor had told her to reduce her stress levels. And she had smiled politely and not said what she was thinking, which was, "How exactly do you suggest I do that?" She texted him instead. "Dinner's ready whenever you get here. Take your time." She didn't mean the last part. She meant every word of the first sentence. At 7 o'clock, the food began to cool. She covered the dishes with foil. She sat down at the table they had picked out together 3 years ago. A long walnut table, heavy and solid. The kind of table you buy when you're thinking about the family you're going to fill it with. And she looked at the 2 plates, the 2 sets of silverware, the 2 crystal glasses she had polished that morning, and she felt the specific, familiar loneliness of a woman who has arranged everything perfectly for a person who isn't there. She didn't cry. She was past the crying stage with Valentino. She had cycled through it enough times that she recognized it now as a weather pattern rather than a disaster, a cold front moving through, and you just waited for it to pass. At 7:45, she got up and poured herself a glass of water. That was when she found them. The wireless earbuds were sitting on the kitchen counter beside the fruit bowl, half hidden under a folded dish towel. Valentino's. The ones he used for calls when he didn't want the conversation on speaker. She recognized the charging case, matte black, small, one corner slightly scuffed from where he dropped it in the parking garage of his office building 6 months ago and hadn't bothered to replace it. She picked them up automatically, intending to set them aside so he wouldn't ask her later if she'd seen them. And then she noticed the small amber light still blinking on the case, still connected. She almost set them down. She almost walked away. For a long moment she stood there with the case in her palm and the amber light pulsing, and she thought about what it would mean to put them in her ears. She was not a suspicious woman by nature. She had never gone through his phone. She had never followed him or hired anyone to follow him or done any of the things that the wives of powerful men sometimes did. The things she had heard about at dinners and charity events and told herself she would never do because she trusted him. She had told herself that a lot over the years. She put the earbuds in. The audio connected immediately. A soft chime. Ambient sound. Music. Something low and hotel lobby smooth. The kind of thing piped through ceiling speakers in places that charged $400 a night and assumed their guests wouldn't question it. Then his voice. She had known Valentino's voice for 9 years. 4 dating, 5 of marriage, 7 if you counted the years she'd simply known him before they were anything. She knew his voice the way you know the sound of your own front door, the particular creak and catch of it that you recognize even half asleep. She knew the voice he used in business, clipped and quiet and absolutely certain. She knew the voice he used with her, softer, sometimes impatient, occasionally warm in ways that still surprised her. She knew the voice he used on the phone with his mother, which was a different voice entirely, almost gentle. This was a voice she had never heard before. "You worry too much," he said, and there was a quality to it, relaxed, almost playful, stripped of the constant tension that lived in his shoulders and jaw every day of their marriage. "Relax, drink your champagne." A woman laughed. Elena's hand came up and pressed flat against the kitchen counter, not for balance exactly, more like her body needed to make contact with something solid. She recognized the laugh. She had heard it at her own wedding, bright and generous over the reception dinner. She had heard it at her baby shower 6 weeks ago, laughing at some joke Elena herself had made, the kind of easy laughter between women who've known each other long enough to find the same things funny. She had heard it dozens of times across dozens of evenings in this penthouse, on that walnut table, over wine and pasta, and the particular comfortable noise of a friendship that had lasted 12 years. Vivian. The name moved through Elena's body like something cold and metallic, not quite pain, not yet, more like the moment after a cut before the nerves catch up. "I'm relaxed," Vivian said, and her voice had a warmth in it that Elena had never heard either, or maybe she had heard it and filed it under something else, something safer. "I've been relaxed since the day you finally stopped pretending." "I was never pretending," Valentino said. "You were married." "That's not the same thing." The silence that followed lasted maybe 4 seconds. Elena counted them without meaning to, standing in her kitchen, in her good dress, the one she'd put on at 3 in the afternoon because she wanted to look nice for dinner, the one that stretched a little now over her stomach and still felt beautiful to her when she'd looked in the mirror. "When?" Vivian asked. Her voice was lower now, quieter, the kind of quiet that wasn't about volume. "When what?" "When are you going to stop? When are you going to—" A pause, the clink of glass. "When are you going to end it with her, Valentino? Really end it, not the way you talk about ending things, and then nothing changes." There was a sound Elena couldn't immediately identify, a soft movement of fabric, and then Valentino's voice came again, and it was calm, the way he was calm when he had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the right moment to announce it. "After the baby is born," he said, "we wait until after the baby." Elena took the earbuds out. She did it so carefully, so deliberately, that she surprised herself. She set both earbuds back in the charging case. She pressed it closed. She placed it exactly where she had found it, beside the fruit bowl, half tucked under the dish towel. Then she stood completely still for what might have been 30 seconds, or might have been 3 minutes. She genuinely couldn't have said, while the music from the kitchen radio played softly, and the candles she had lit at 5 o'clock burned down a little further, and the food she had spent 11 hours cooking sat covered in foil in the kitchen of her 42nd floor penthouse on Thanksgiving Eve, after the baby is born. Not "it's nothing," no "I made a mistake," not "this was one time and I ended it and I'm sorry." Just that flat, practical, organized calendar entry. Wait until after the baby. Handle the current obligation first, then proceed to the next phase. She was the current obligation. The baby was the current phase. And Vivian, who had been her best friend, who had stood 6 inches to her left at her wedding in a pale blue dress and cried genuine tears at the vows, who had pressed both palms to Elena's stomach 3 weeks ago when the baby kicked and said, "Oh my God, I felt him," with wonder in her voice. Vivian was apparently the next chapter. Elena walked to the dining room table. She sat down in her chair, not his chair, her chair, the one she always used, and she looked at the table she had set with such care. The candles had dripped a little wax, but were still burning. The wine she'd poured for Valentino was still full. Her own glass of sparkling water had a ring of condensation beneath it. The small vase of flowers she'd picked up at the corner market on Wednesday, because she thought they would make the table feel warm, had started to droop slightly on one side, the way flowers do when the water needs changing. She looked at all of it for a long time. Then she stood up, walked to the home office, opened the bottom drawer of the desk, the one she'd been quietly filling for the past month, the one Valentino didn't know about and had never thought to ask about because powerful men who believe their wives are too overwhelmed with pregnancy to notice anything rarely check the bottom desk drawer. And she pulled out a manila envelope. She had prepared it carefully. The attorney, a woman named Celeste Rowan, whom Elena had found after a great deal of private research and 2 discreet consultations conducted while Valentino was traveling, had told her she could file at any time. Elena had been waiting. She hadn't been sure what she was waiting for, not exactly. Maybe confirmation. Maybe one more chance for the evidence she had been gathering to be wrong. Maybe she had simply needed to hear it for herself, in his voice, in that easy hotel room tone. She carried the envelope to the dining room table. She set it in the center of Valentino's place setting, just beside his fork, at a slight angle the way you'd place a menu at a formal restaurant. She stood back and looked at it. Then she leaned forward and, with the same hands that had spent 11 hours cooking Thanksgiving dinner, she blew out the candles one by one. The last candle went out, and the room went gray, lit only by the ambient glow of Manhattan through the floor-to-ceiling windows, that strange non-darkness of a city that never fully goes to sleep. Elena straightened up, one hand on her lower back where the ache had settled in for the night. "Happy Thanksgiving, Valentino," she said. To no one. To the empty room. To the table that had been meant for 2 and was now just evidence of something she had refused to see for a long time. She picked up her glass of sparkling water and walked to the bedroom and got ready for bed, with the methodical calm of a woman who has made a decision, so final it has moved past the point of emotion into something quieter and more permanent. Valentino Moretti came home at 2:17 in the morning. She knew because she heard the elevator, heard his shoes on the hardwood, heard him stop in the dining room for longer than it would take to simply walk through it. She lay in the dark and listened to the silence that followed. The feared head of the Moretti syndicate, the man who had survived 3 assassination attempts and dismantled 4 competing organizations in 12 years, stood in his own dining room for 6 full minutes without making a sound. Then she heard him walk to the bedroom door. She closed her eyes. She steadied her breathing, and she let him believe just for tonight that she was asleep. Tomorrow, when he tried to explain it, when he reached for every tool he had ever used to navigate his way out of a problem, the commanding voice, the controlled apology, the surgical placement of blame, he would find that the woman lying in that bed was no longer the one he had been managing for 7 years. Elena Moretti had spent 11 hours cooking a Thanksgiving dinner for a man who was drinking champagne in a hotel suite with her best friend. She had spent considerably longer than that becoming someone that man had fundamentally failed to pay attention to. That was his first mistake. Believing she hadn't noticed was his second. What came next would teach him, in ways no amount of power or fear could protect against, exactly what it cost to treat the wrong woman like furniture in her own life. He was standing at the foot of the bed when she opened her eyes. She hadn't planned to open them. She had intended to keep the performance going, the slow breathing, the stillness, the pretense of sleep that had gotten her through the rest of that night without having to say a single word before she was ready. But something woke her at 6:42 in the morning, some shift in the air or a sound too subtle to name, and when she turned her head, Valentino was there, still in his clothes from the night before, his jacket hanging open, his tie loosened, standing at the foot of the bed and watching her with an expression she had never seen on his face in 7 years of marriage. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was closer to calculation. He was already working the problem. She sat up slowly, one hand going to the small of her back out of habit. "How long have you been standing there?" she said. "Not long." "That's not an answer." He sat down on the edge of the bed, on his side, and put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. It was such an uncharacteristically defeated posture that for one fractured second she felt the old reflex move through her, the impulse to reach out, to soften, to make it easier for him. 7 years had built that reflex deep into her nervous system. It took real effort to leave her hand where it was. "Elena," he said, "don't. I need you to let me—" "I said don't." Her voice was quiet, not shaking. She had expected it to shake and it didn't, and that surprised her enough that she paused on it for a moment, that steadiness, before she continued. "I heard you. Last night. Your earbuds were on the counter and they were still connected, and I heard everything, Valentino. So whatever you were about to say, whatever version of this you've been practicing in your head since you found those papers, you can put it away." The silence that followed was the specific silence of a man recalibrating. She watched it happen. She had watched Valentino recalibrate in difficult situations before, in meetings that had gone sideways, in phone calls where the news was bad, at the hospital when his father had died and he'd stood in the corridor for 90 seconds, and then walked back into the room. A different version of himself, composed and functional. He was very good at it. It was one of the things she had once admired about him, that ability to absorb impact and keep moving. "How much did you hear?" he said. "All of it." Another silence. "Elena, how long?" she said. He looked up then. His jaw was tight. "That's not—" "How long, Valentino?" He looked back at the floor. 8 months. The number hit her differently than she expected. Not because it was longer than she'd feared, though it was significantly longer than the vague, recent things she had been allowing herself to imagine, but because of what 8 months meant in calendar terms. 8 months ago, she had been newly pregnant. 8 months ago, they had sat in this bedroom together after the ultrasound, and Valentino had held the printout of the scan in both hands and looked at it for a long time without speaking, and she had thought he was moved, and maybe he had been, and apparently he had also been 8 months deep into her best friend at the same time, and the human brain was simply not designed to hold those two facts simultaneously without something breaking. "While I was pregnant," she said. Not a question. He didn't answer. "Look at me," she said. He looked at her. "While I was pregnant," she said again. It didn't start because of the pregnancy. It started before." "That's worse," she said. "That is actually worse. Do you understand that?" He opened his mouth and closed it again. She got out of bed. It was harder at 7 months than it used to be, and she hated that he was watching her do it, hated the brief gracelessness of it. But she did it, and she stood up and she walked to the window and looked out at Manhattan in the early morning gray, the buildings just beginning to catch the first pale light, the city entirely indifferent to what was happening on the 42nd floor. "I have an appointment this morning," she said. "I want you gone before I get back." "Elena, this is my home." She turned around. "Say that again," she said. Something in her face must have communicated something precise, because he didn't say it again. "I'll be back this afternoon," he said instead. "We need to talk about this properly. What you're doing—" He gestured vaguely at the room, at the direction of the dining room, at the implication of what she'd left on the table. "This isn't a solution. You're 7 months pregnant. You can't just—" "I already have," she said. "That's what you're not understanding yet. It's already done." She crossed her arms, not defensively, just because she needed something to do with her hands. "I didn't decide this last night, Valentino. I didn't decide it when I heard you on the phone. I've been deciding it for months. Last night just told me the decision was right." He stood up. He was tall, Valentino. Not imposing in the theatrical way that people expected from men in his position, but solidly, quietly tall in a way that filled rooms. She had always been aware of the physical fact of him. She was aware of it now too, and she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she didn't care. "You're making a mistake," he said. "I made a mistake," she said. "I made it at the altar, and I've been making it every day since, and I'm done. The papers are served. That process is in motion, and there is nothing you can do to stop it. What I need from you right now is to not be here when I get home." He crossed the room toward her, and she didn't move, didn't step back, just watched him come, and he stopped about 3 feet away and looked at her with something that had the shape of emotion, but that she no longer trusted herself to read accurately. "I love you," he said. She had known he would say it. She had almost timed it, the way you time the predictable beats in a song you've heard too many times. "You don't," she said, And that's okay. I think you convinced yourself you did for a long time. And I think maybe at the beginning something about it was real, but what you love, Valentino, is control. You love having things arranged the way you want them. And I was arranged. I was exactly where you put me, and I was convenient, and I was having your child, and that's what you love, not me. She paused. Vivian can have it. I'm out. She walked to the bathroom and closed the door. She stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrists the way her mother had taught her to do when she was small and couldn't stop crying. Not because of any medical logic, but because the cold was a simple physical fact that pulled you back into your body and out of wherever your mind was trying to take you. She stood there for 2 full minutes with the water running. Then she dried her hands, looked at herself in the mirror once, long enough to confirm she was still herself, still intact, still standing, and reached for her toothbrush. I was gone by the time she came out. She had not heard him leave. The apartment felt different without him in it. Not emptier. If anything, it felt like it could breathe. She sat at the kitchen table and ate toast and called her attorney. Celeste Rowan picked up on the second ring in the way of women who have been doing important work for many years and have learned that delayed responses are a form of control they no longer need. He's been served, Elena said. Good. Celeste's voice was unhurried. She had the particular calm of someone who had navigated enough ugly situations to understand that drama was rarely useful. How did he take it? About how I expected. Has he made any threats? Elena thought about it. Not directly. He said I was making a mistake. That's not a threat. That's a deflection. Standard. A pause. A soft sound of papers moving. Elena, I need you to listen to me about something. Given who your husband is, and given the nature of his business operations, I want you to be very careful in the next few weeks about your communications. Your phone, your email, anything digital. Can you tell me where you are right now? Home. He just left. Will you stay with someone for the next few nights? Elena looked around the penthouse that she had decorated and maintained and lived in for 5 years, and that had never quite felt entirely like hers. No, she said. I'm not going to be pushed out of my own home. That's your right, Celeste said. Just be aware that the dynamics of divorce proceedings with men in Valentino's position tend to escalate before they stabilize. He will feel that he is losing control of a situation. Men like him respond to that in specific ways. I know how he responds, Elena said. I know you do. I just need to make sure you're prepared for the fact that knowing it and living through it are 2 different things. After she hung up, Elena sat for a long time with her phone face down on the table and her hand flat on her stomach and the toast going cold. The baby moved. A slow roll, the kind of movement that had started in the last few weeks, less like fluttering and more like something intentional, something with weight and direction. She pressed her palm more firmly and felt the movement subside and then resume, a small, steady presence that was the only uncomplicated thing in her entire life at that moment. I know, she said quietly. I know. She was still sitting there when her phone buzzed. The text was from Vivian. Hey, is everything okay? Valentino called me. He sounded strange. Are you all right? Elena stared at the screen for a long time. Then she typed back, Everything's fine. Don't worry about it. She hit send, turned the phone over, and didn't look at it again for the rest of the morning. Valentino did not come back that afternoon. He came back that evening at 7 o'clock, and he did not come alone. He brought Marco, his oldest consigliere, a thin man in his 60s with white hair and the permanent expression of someone who has long since stopped being surprised by human behavior. And he brought his cousin Nico, who was 32 and handled things that didn't get discussed in detail. Elena recognized the composition of the group immediately for what it was. Valentino had decided this was a negotiation, and he had brought advisors. She had made pasta. She was eating it at the kitchen table when they came through the door, and she did not get up. You brought people to my house, she said. Our house, Valentino said. Marco, she nodded at the older man. Nico. She looked back at her pasta. You can both wait in the hall. Marco looked at Valentino. Valentino kept his eyes on Elena. They stay, he said. They leave, she said. Or I call Celeste Rowan right now and tell her that my husband entered the marital home with associates during active divorce proceedings, and we let her decide what to do with that information. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. "Give us the room," Valentino said. Marco and Nico went back through the door without a word. Valentino sat down across from her at the kitchen table. The kitchen table, not the dining room, because Elena was not interested in symbolic staging. And he laid both hands flat on the surface and looked at her with an expression she recognized now as his working face, the one that meant he had already mapped the terrain and identified his angles. "You can't take the baby out of New York," he said. "I'm not planning to. You can't cut off my access. I'm not planning to do that either." "Then what is it you want, Elena? What is this?" She put her fork down. "It's a divorce, Valentino. That's what it is. I want a divorce. I want shared custody arranged legally and cleanly. I want this apartment bought out or sold. I want the financial settlement that Celeste has already drawn up reviewed by both parties, and I want to be done." "Done." He said the word like he was testing it. "Just done, after 7 years." "You were done 8 months ago," she said. "I'm just catching up." Something moved across his face that wasn't quite anger. It was something beneath anger, something more fundamental and less controlled. And for a fraction of a second, she saw the man under the machine, genuinely unsettled. "She means nothing," he said. "Valentino." Her voice was tired now, a different quality of tired than she'd felt in the morning. "Please don't." "I'm telling you, I heard you tell her you'd leave me after the baby was born." She held his eyes. "Those are not the words of a man for whom someone means nothing. Those are the words of a man who has a plan. And I'm not interested in being part of your plan anymore." She picked up her fork again. "I'd like to finish my dinner." He sat there for another moment, hands still flat on the table, jaw working slightly the way it did when he was holding something back. Then he said, "You think this is simple?" "I think divorce is one of the least simple things a person can do," she said. "I've been thinking about it for months. I'm not under any illusions about what it involves." "You don't know what it involves." His voice had dropped to a register she associated with his most serious moments, the weight of everything he actually was coming into it. "Not with me. Not with my name, my business, my family. If you go to court, if this becomes public, then it becomes public," she said. "Elena, I am not threatening you," she said. "I'm not interested in your business. I'm not interested in your family's reputation or your syndicate or any of it. I want out of this marriage, and I want my son to grow up in a house where nobody's lying to him. That's the entire list." She met his eyes again. "But if you make this difficult, if you come at me the way I can see you're considering coming at me, then I will have no choice but to let the lawyers do what lawyers do, and that will be considerably worse for you than a quiet settlement." The threat was clean and precise, and she'd practiced the exact phrasing of it with Celeste until it sat flat in her mouth without any shake in it. Valentino looked at her for a long moment. "You've changed," he said. "You finally noticed," she said. He left 20 minutes later. He didn't slam the door. That was almost more unsettling than if he had. 3 days passed. Elena spent them in the apartment, working from home, answering emails, having phone calls with Celeste, eating reasonable meals and sleeping in careful positions, and taking the prenatal vitamins she sometimes forgot, and trying not to think too hard about any single thing for too long, because thinking too hard about too many things at once was exactly what the doctor had told her to avoid. On the 4th day, her editor at the design firm where she'd been doing freelance consulting texted to say that her login credentials had been deactivated due to an unspecified administrative issue and that HR would be in touch. She stared at the text. Then she called Celeste. "It's him," Celeste said. It wasn't a question. "The firm has 4 Moretti-adjacent clients," Elena said. "He could make a call." "He did make a call," Celeste said. "Or someone made it for him." A pause. "Elena, this is what escalation looks like. He's removing your independence because he knows that financial pressure changes the calculus of a divorce. He wants you less stable." Another pause. "Are you financially okay for the immediate future?" "I have savings." She had been quiet about the savings for years. She had been quiet about a lot of things. "Good. Don't move them. Don't do anything that looks reactive. Let him make his moves and document every one of them." Celeste's voice took on a different edge. "And I want you to start keeping a log. Dates, times, anything unusual. Anyone watching the building, any strange cars, any communication that doesn't feel right." "You think he'd have me followed?" Celeste paused for a moment. That was answer enough. Start the log today, she said. Elena started the log that afternoon in a plain notebook she had bought at the pharmacy downstairs. She wrote the date and the time and what had happened with her job in handwriting that was more careful than usual, like the precision of the letters could stand in for the control she was working to maintain. Then she turned to a new page and wrote the date again, and beside it wrote, car, black, parked across from building entrance, same as yesterday. She had noticed it 2 days ago and told herself she was being paranoid. She stopped telling herself that. On the 6th day after the papers were served, Vivian called. Elena let it go to voicemail. Vivian left a message. Her voice sounded strange, Elena thought, when she listened to it later. Not guilty exactly, more tight, like someone speaking a prepared text they haven't quite finished memorizing. She said she'd heard about the divorce, that she was concerned, that she hoped Elena was okay, that she wanted to talk. Elena deleted the message and wrote the phone call in her log. On the 8th day, she was coming back from her OB/GYN appointment. A routine visit, everything normal, the baby's position good, her blood pressure higher than the doctor liked but not high enough to be an emergency, which felt like a reasonable metaphor for her life. When she stepped out of the elevator on the 42nd floor and found Valentino's cousin, Nico, standing in the hallway outside her door. He wasn't doing anything threatening. I was just standing there, hands in his pockets, in the particular way that men with Nico's function stood in hallways, not quite leaning on anything, not quite looking at anything, present in a way that was difficult to ignore and that wasn't an accident. Elena stopped a few feet away from him. "What are you doing here, Nico?" "Valentino wanted me to check you were okay." His voice was flat and even. He was not an unkind man, she thought, not a cruel one. He was a man who did what he was told and had been doing it long enough that he no longer distinguished between instruction and inclination. "I'm fine," she said, "as you can see." "He worries about you." "Tell him I don't need him to worry about me." She reached past him to unlock the door. "And tell him that if I come home and find someone outside my door again, I'll be talking to my attorney about it before I've taken my coat off." Nico nodded once, shifted his weight, and moved toward the elevator without another word. Elena went inside, locked the door, put her back against it, and stood there for a moment. Her hands were shaking. She hadn't noticed when they'd started. She wrote it in the log. Nico Moretti. Hallway. Outside apartment, 4:18 p.m. Said Valentino sent him to check on me. She underlined the last part twice. Then she called Celeste and read it to her word for word, and listened to what Celeste said next. And when the call ended, she sat down on the couch and stared at the ceiling, and thought about the woman she had been 11 days ago. The woman lighting candles and covering dishes with foil, and choosing to believe that this time would be different. She did not feel sorry for that woman. She felt something more specific than sorry, a kind of clear-eyed compassion for someone who had been working with inadequate information for a very long time. The compassion lasted about 4 minutes. Then the practical part of her brain reasserted itself, the part that had been quietly building the case and keeping the log and speaking carefully with Celeste and moving money into accounts that existed in her name only and had for the past 3 months. And she sat up straight, put her feet on the floor, picked up her notebook, and turned to a new page. The date at the top. The time. And then, in the careful handwriting she had adopted for this particular notebook, she wrote, "He's not going to stop." She looked at it for a moment. Then on the line below it she wrote, "Neither am I." What she didn't write, what she couldn't have written because she didn't know it yet, because the information was still inside a server inside a financial office on the west side of Manhattan that no one had looked at closely enough, not yet, was the thing that would change everything. The thing that wasn't just about a marriage ending or a man refusing to let go, but about money. A great deal of money, moved through structures that existed specifically because they weren't supposed to be traced, moved in ways that left marks that money always left, if someone with the right skills and the right motivation went looking. Vivian Hale's name was on 4 of those structures. Elena didn't know that yet, but the night Valentino Moretti transferred the last of those funds, he made the single most irreversible mistake of his entire career. Not in business, not in the criminal world he had built his name inside, but in the private and devastating world of a marriage he had been burning down from the inside for 8 months without ever once considering what might be left standing in the ashes. He had made Elena Moretti invisible for 7 years. He was about to discover what invisible women see. The call came on a Tuesday morning, 17 days after the papers were served. Elena was in the kitchen making coffee when her phone rang. Not Celeste, not a number she recognized, but a 212 area code, Manhattan, and something about the timing of it, 9:43 on a Tuesday, when the world was already in motion and people who needed to reach you urgently had already been thinking about it for hours, made her pick up. "Is this Elena Moretti?" The voice was a woman's, measured, professional, without being cold. "Who's calling?" "My name is Dana Rice. I'm a forensic accountant. I've been retained by an attorney named Gerald Park on behalf of several business entities connected to the Moretti family holdings." A brief pause. "I'm not calling in an official capacity. I'm calling because I found something, and I think you need to know about it before anyone else makes a move." Elena set down her coffee cup very carefully on the counter. "How did you get this number?" "It's listed on a filing, a joint property document from 2021. Another pause. "Mrs. Moretti, I know this is unusual. I know you have no reason to trust me. But I've been looking at these accounts for 3 weeks, and what I found—" A slight break in the professional register, something underneath it that sounded like genuine discomfort. "It involves someone close to you, and it's not small." Elena pulled out a chair and sat down. "Talk," she said. Dana Rice talked for 22 minutes. Elena didn't move for most of it. She sat with her elbow on the table and her forehead resting in her free hand and listened to a forensic accountant she had never met describe, in precise and clinical language, how her husband had spent the past 14 months systematically moving money. Not small amounts, not the kind of transfers that blurred into normal operating expenses, but significant structured movements of funds from Moretti-controlled businesses through a series of shell companies into accounts held by a consulting firm called VH Advisory Group. VH Advisory Group had one registered officer, Vivian Hale. "The structure was designed to look like legitimate consulting contracts," Dana said. "Invoices, service agreements, the paperwork is thorough. But there are no deliverables, no actual consulting work product. It's essentially a financial tunnel. Money goes in dirty, comes out looking like business income." "He was laundering money through her," Elena said. Her voice came out flat, almost affectless, because she was processing too many things simultaneously to let any one of them shape her tone. "That's what the pattern indicates." Dana paused. "Mrs. Moretti, the total amount moved through these accounts over 14 months is approximately $4.3 million. The kitchen was very quiet. "She knew," Elena said. "Vivian knew what it was." "The account requires her signature. The incorporation documents have her signature. The tax filings, which are separately a significant problem, have her signature." Dana's voice was careful. "She would have to have known." Elena stood up. She walked to the window. She didn't look at anything in particular. She looked at the middle distance, at the space between herself and the city below, and she thought about Vivian Hale's hands on her stomach 3 weeks before any of this broke open, the wonder in her voice, the warmth of it, and she felt something shift in her chest that wasn't grief and wasn't anger, but was something colder and more final than either. "Why are you telling me this?" Elena said. "Because I think your husband is about to use this as leverage." Dana's voice dropped slightly. "Not against you directly, against the proceedings. He's already retained 2 additional attorneys, not divorce attorneys, asset attorneys, the kind you bring in when you're preparing to move or obscure holdings before a settlement. If these accounts get folded into that process before anyone looks at them properly, they become very hard to trace, and if they become hard to trace, he walks away clean." "He walks away cleaner than he deserves to," Dana said. "Yes." Elena turned from the window. "Send me everything you have," she said. "I can't send official documents. I'm still under—" "Send me what you can," Elena said. "Whatever isn't bound, and tell me who I need to call." The package arrived electronically within the hour. Not official documents, but Dana's own working notes, summaries, account references formatted in the careful shorthand of someone who had been taking private notes alongside their professional ones. It was enough. It was considerably more than enough. Elena forwarded it to Celeste with a single line. "Call me the moment you see this." Celeste called back in 11 minutes. "Where did you get this?" was the first thing she said. Elena told her. "This changes everything," Celeste said. Not with excitement, with the particular focused gravity of an attorney who has just watched the nature of a case transform beneath her feet. Elena, this isn't just a divorce anymore. This is a federal matter. The financial structures involved, the amounts, the connection to Moretti business operations. This goes to a completely different level. I know. You understand what I'm saying? If we take this to the right people, this becomes a federal investigation into money laundering connected to organized crime. Valentino doesn't just lose the divorce. He potentially— I know what it means, Elena said. I know exactly what it means. Silence on the line for a moment. What do you want to do? Celeste asked. Elena looked down at her notebook, at the log she had been keeping, at all the careful dated entries and the underlined notes, and the 2 sentences she had written on the night Nico Moretti stood outside her door. He's not going to stop. Neither am I. Make the calls, Elena said. She hung up and sat very still for approximately 1 minute. Then she picked up her phone and called Vivian. It rang 3 times, and Vivian picked up with a voice that was doing something complicated, trying to sound normal, trying to sound concerned, layered over something tight and vigilant that Elena recognized now as the voice of someone waiting to find out how much the other person knows. Elena, hey, I've been worried about you. How are you feeling? Fine, Elena said. Can we meet today? I need to talk to you. A half-second pause that Vivian covered smoothly. Of course. Where? The coffee place on 72nd, 2 o'clock. I'll be there. Elena arrived 8 minutes early and chose a table in the back corner, the kind of table where you can see the door and the door cannot easily see you, a habit she had picked up without ever quite noticing from years of watching how Valentino positioned himself in rooms. She ordered chamomile because her stomach was doing something she didn't want to encourage, and she sat with both hands around the cup and waited. Vivian came in at 2:03, in a camel coat Elena had seen before. She'd been with Vivian when she bought it, at a boutique in Soho, 8 months ago, roughly the same timeline as everything else Elena was now reconstructing in her head with brutal and unwelcome clarity. She was carrying a large tote bag, and her hair was down, and she looked, Elena thought, like someone who had been practicing a particular expression in the mirror this morning. Warm, concerned, slightly anxious, in a way designed to communicate that the anxiety was about Elena. She sat down across the table and reached immediately for Elena's hand. Elena let her take it. She watched Vivian's face as she did. You look exhausted, Vivian said. Are you sleeping? Is the baby okay? Baby's fine, Elena said. Vivian, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth. Something moved very fast across Vivian's face and then went still. Of course, she said. How long have you been involved with Valentino? The hand holding hers tightened slightly. An involuntary thing. Vivian's eyes didn't move from Elena's face, but something in them shifted. A small internal adjustment, the recalibration Elena had seen in Valentino on Thanksgiving morning, and that apparently both of them had learned from the same place, which was the instinct of people who needed to manage how much they revealed in any given moment. Elena, I know, Elena said. I heard you on the phone Thanksgiving. His earbuds were on the counter. I know about the hotel. I know it's been 8 months. I know what he said about waiting until after the baby. She paused. But I'm asking you directly because you were my closest friend, and I'm giving you the chance to tell me yourself. Vivian looked down at the table. Her hand was still holding Elena's. Elena didn't pull away. I'm sorry, Vivian said. Her voice was low. I know you are, Elena said. I believe that part. And she did, actually. Not because it absolved anything, but because she had known Vivian for 12 years and she recognized the specific quality of the way it came from a real place even while existing alongside every other thing that had also been real. People were not simple. She had always known that. She was learning it in a more granular way than she had expected. How did it start? Elena asked. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Around them, the coffee shop made its small sounds. The machine steaming milk, a conversation at another table, the door opening and closing. He called me, Vivian said, after your baby shower. He said he needed to talk to someone who knew you, who understood what he was. She stopped. I know how that sounds. Tell me about VH Advisory Group, Elena said. The change in Vivian's face was immediate and total. The warmth drained out of it. The carefully maintained texture of the sorry dissolved. What was underneath was something stark and frightened. and it was the first fully honest expression Elena had seen from her in this conversation. "How do you know about that?" she said. Her voice had changed entirely. 14 months, Elena said. 4.3 million. Your signature on the incorporation documents, the service agreements, the tax filings. She kept her voice even. "Vivian, you're in serious trouble." Vivian pulled her hand back. She wrapped both arms around herself and looked away, toward the window, and Elena watched the calculation moving behind her eyes with a speed and clarity that was new, or not new. Elena was beginning to understand that it had always been there, that she simply hadn't been looking for it. "He told me it was clean," Vivian said. "It isn't." "He said the structure was legal, that it was just business income routing." "It's money laundering," Elena said. "That's what forensic accountants call it when there's no actual work product and the money originates from criminal enterprises." Vivian's jaw tightened. "I didn't know." "You signed the filings." "He told me it was fine." Her voice was sharp now, defensive, cutting through the affect. "Elena, I was not." She stopped. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. "He said it was just admin, that I didn't need to understand the details, that he would handle everything and I just needed to be the name on the account," Elena said. Vivian looked at her. The silence between them had a texture that their 12-year friendship had never produced before. Not comfortable silence, not the charged silence of an argument, but the silence of two people who have just arrived at the real shape of a thing they've both been living inside without seeing. "He used you," Elena said. Not cruelly, just factually. Vivian's eyes went wet. She looked out the window again. "I thought—" She stopped. "You thought you were going to be his wife," Elena said. Vivian didn't answer. She didn't need to. Elena could see the answer in the line of her shoulders, in the way she was holding herself together very carefully, in the specific quality of her silence, which was the silence of a woman who had organized a significant portion of the last year around a version of the future that had just become impossible. "He told you after the baby," Elena said. "He said as soon as the divorce was—" "He was using that too," Elena said. "The promise of the timeline. He was using it to keep you patient, to keep you available, to keep you signing documents. You were management, Vivian. You were a solution to a financial problem." Vivian pressed both hands flat on the table. Her knuckles were pale. "Don't," she said. "I'm not saying it to hurt you," Elena said. "I'm saying it because you need to understand what he did before you decide what to do next. Because the federal investigators who are going to start looking at these accounts very soon are not going to care why you signed. They're going to care that you signed." Vivian looked at her then, directly, fully, with something behind her eyes that Elena recognized after a moment as the particular clarity that arrives when a person runs out of alternative narratives to retreat into. "What do I do?" Vivian said. "Talk to a lawyer," Elena said. "Today. Not Valentino's lawyers. Your own." She left $20 on the table for the tea she hadn't finished and stood up and put on her coat, which took a moment longer than it used to because of the pregnancy, and Vivian watched her do it without speaking. At the door, Elena turned back. "I don't forgive you," she said. "I want to be honest about that. Maybe at some point. Not now." She paused. "But I don't want you destroyed by him either. You weren't the only one he lied to. You were just the one who made it easier for him by believing he was different with you." She looked at her for a moment longer. "He isn't different with anyone. That's the part that took me too long to understand." She walked out into the November cold. What came next happened fast. Within 48 hours of Elena's conversation with Celeste, the financial documents were in the hands of a federal attorney Celeste knew through channels Elena didn't ask about. Within 72 hours, there were quiet, preliminary conversations happening at a level that had nothing to do with divorce court. Valentino found out on a Friday. Elena didn't hear from him directly. She heard from Marco, which was worse in a specific way. Marco calling her on a number she hadn't given him meant that the machinery around Valentino was responding, that it had identified her as the source, and that the people who made problems disappear for the Moretti syndicate were now aware that she was the problem. "Mrs. Moretti." Marco's voice on the phone was what it always was. Even, measured, the voice of a man who spoke carefully because imprecision had consequences. "I hope you understand what you've done." "I understand it clearly," she said. "There are people, not your husband, People with significant investments in the stability of the Moretti organization who are going to see this as a very serious act. Tell those people, Elena said, that I am 7.5 months pregnant, that I am a private citizen with no criminal record, and that if anything happens to me or to my child, the complete package of documents currently held by multiple attorneys and one federal contact will be released simultaneously to 4 separate investigative journalists. She paused. I've been Valentino Moretti's wife for 7 years, Marco. I know how this works. I know what the leverage is. Tell them. She hung up. Her hands were shaking again. They had been shaking a lot lately, and she had stopped fighting it. The shaking was information. It was her body being honest about what her voice was working hard to conceal. She went to the bathroom and ran cold water over her wrists. She looked at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back was 2 months from giving birth, had been systematically watched and followed and economically pressured by her estranged husband, had just handed forensic evidence of organized crime money laundering to federal investigators, and had told the consigliere of a criminal syndicate to deliver a message on her behalf. She had not planned to be this person. She had planned to be a wife. She had planned to set a Thanksgiving table and light candles and have her husband come home. The woman in the mirror looked like someone who had survived the gap between those two things. Not without cost, not cleanly, but standing. She dried her hands and went back to her notebook. She opened it to a new page. At the top, she wrote the date, and then below it, she started writing everything she could remember from the Marco call. The time, his exact words, the number he'd called from, the specific phrasing of the threat that wasn't quite a threat, but unmistakably was. She wrote carefully and completely, and when she was finished, she took a photo of the page with her phone and sent it to Celeste with a timestamp. She was on the last line of the entry when her phone buzzed with a news alert. She almost ignored it. She almost put the phone down and finished writing and went to bed. Instead, she tapped the notification. The alert was brief. A local business news item, the kind that lived for 3 hours on the financial pages before being buried under something more significant. The headline read, Moretti-affiliated holdings under SEC preliminary review following anomalous transaction reports. She read it 3 times. Then she put the phone face down on the table, pressed both palms flat beside it, and breathed. The SEC. Not just a federal attorney's office, not just a preliminary conversation. The Securities and Exchange Commission, with its own investigators and its own timelines and its own considerable appetite for precisely the kind of structured financial irregularity that Dana Rice had spent 3 weeks mapping with her careful forensic hands. This was no longer Elena's divorce. This was now something that had its own gravity, its own momentum, pulling in a direction that neither she nor Valentino nor Vivian had the ability to redirect. She thought about Valentino reading that same alert, somewhere across the city, in whatever room he had retreated to in the last 3 weeks since she had refused to be managed out of her own home. She thought about what his face would look like. She had seen his face in a great many situations over 7 years, but she had never seen it in a situation where the mechanism he had built to protect himself had turned and was pointing at him, and she found she couldn't quite picture it, couldn't quite imagine the particular configuration of the Mafia Boss's face when the thing falling apart was his own empire rather than someone else's. She picked up the phone again. She found Celeste's number and was about to call when another message came through. This one not a news alert, not a number she didn't recognize, but a text from a number she knew by heart. A number she had known for 8 months before she knew what it meant to know it. And the text said only, "He knows it was you. He's not going to let this go. Elena, you need to be very careful." It was from Vivian. Elena stared at the message for a long moment. She thought about 12 years of friendship. She thought about a pale blue bridesmaid dress and hands pressed to a pregnant stomach and champagne glasses in a hotel suite. She thought about a woman who had let herself be used as a financial instrument by a man who had told her she was something else entirely. She thought about the fact that Vivian, despite everything, had just warned her. She typed back, "I know, I'm handling it. Did you call a lawyer?" The response came back in less than a minute. "Yes, this morning." Elena put the phone down. She looked at her notebook. She looked at the careful log she had been keeping. She looked at the date at the top of the current page and did the arithmetic to her due date and came up with 7 weeks. And she thought about what 7 weeks meant, about what she needed to build in 7 weeks, about what a woman alone, not entirely alone, she had Celeste, she had her savings, She had the documents in multiple hands, could build between now and the moment her son arrived in a world that had become considerably more complicated than she had intended. She was not going to be afraid. She had made that decision on a Thanksgiving Eve, standing in a dark dining room with cold food and blown-out candles, and she had been remaking it every day since, and she was going to keep remaking it. But she was also not going to be naive. She had used up her allocation of naive. Valentino Moretti had spent 14 months building a financial structure designed to protect himself, using the woman he claimed to love as its foundation. And now that structure was being dismantled from directions he hadn't anticipated, and the man who had survived assassination attempts and cartel wars and federal investigations was sitting somewhere in this city working out what to do next. Men like Valentino always had a next move. She needed to be ready before he made it, because the next move of a man who has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous move of all. And the question Elena Moretti was sitting with in her kitchen at 11 o'clock on a Friday night. Her notebook open, her phone charged, her door locked, her son turning slowly in the dark warmth of her body with the patient indifference of someone not yet required to understand any of this, was not whether Valentino would move. It was whether she had already moved further than he knew. The subpoena arrived on a Monday. Not for Elena. For the building management company that owned the servers controlling the security cameras in her apartment building, specifically the footage from the 42nd floor corridor covering the past 60 days. Celeste called her before 9 in the morning to tell her, and Elena stood in the kitchen in her robe with her coffee going cold and listened to her attorney explain what it meant with the focused attention of someone who has learned to absorb information without reacting to it until they understand it fully. "It's a federal subpoena," Celeste said, "which means the investigation is formally opened. This isn't preliminary anymore." "Nico," Elena said. "The footage will show Nico outside my door." "Among other things, yes." Celeste paused. "Elena, I want you to understand what this week is going to look like. The SEC review goes active today. There will be agents at the Moretti financial offices by Wednesday at the latest. Valentino's attorneys are going to file emergency motions, probably a custody preemptive, trying to establish grounds before the baby comes, trying to paint you as unstable or uncooperative or in some kind of compromised environment. On what basis? They'll manufacture one. Celeste's voice was flat and certain. That's what emergency motions are for. They don't have to stick, they just have to slow things down, create noise, give him room to maneuver. I need you to be prepared for something to land this week that is designed purely to destabilize you." Elena looked out the window. The sky was white and low, the particular New York November sky that wasn't quite threatening snow, but wasn't ruling it out either. "I'm prepared," she said. "Are you sleeping?" "Enough." "Elena, I'm sleeping enough," she said. "What do I need to do today?" What she needed to do today was meet with Celeste at 10, provide a formal statement about the Nico incident for the building's legal team, who were now also involved because of the subpoena, call her OBGYN because she had a scheduled check-in, and she was not going to miss it regardless of what else was happening, and review a 40-page financial disclosure document that Celeste's office had prepared, which laid out the entirety of Elena's personal assets, the ones she had been quietly managing for 3 years, and that existed in her name only, and that Valentino had never paid enough attention to because he had never considered that she might be paying attention. She did all of it. She moved through the day with the methodical steadiness she had been cultivating since Thanksgiving, the quality of motion that wasn't calm exactly, but was adjacent to it, purposeful, sequential, one thing at a time, because the alternative was to let the full weight of everything land simultaneously, and she could not afford that. At the OBGYN's office, the doctor told her the baby was in excellent position, head down, well-placed, measuring right on schedule. Her blood pressure was still elevated. "I need you to reduce your stress load," the doctor said, in the tone of someone who says something enough times that it has become a kind of ritual rather than actual advice. "I'm working on it," Elena said. "Are you experiencing any significant emotional disturbances? Any acute anxiety?" Elena looked at her. "My husband is under federal investigation, and I'm 8 months pregnant and filing for divorce." The doctor looked back at her for a moment. "Okay," she said. "We'll recheck in 2 weeks. Call me immediately if you feel any unusual pressure or if anything changes." It was on the way out of the building, in the small vestibule between the inner door and the street, that Elena saw the man. He was across the street. standing near a parked car, not leaning against it, just standing near it with his hands in his coat pockets and his face angled in her direction. She had never seen him before. He was not Nico, not Marco, no one she could place, which was in some ways more alarming than a familiar face. A familiar face meant Valentino was handling this himself, through his usual people. An unfamiliar face meant he had reached outside his usual circle. She walked to the curb and got into the car she had prearranged. Not a cab, not a rideshare, but a car driven by a man Celeste's office used, a retired NYPD detective named Frank, who charged a premium and didn't ask unnecessary questions. "Across the street," she said as she got in. "Gray coat. Don't look directly." Frank pulled away from the curb with a smooth, unhurried motion that looked like nothing and covered a lot of ground quickly. "I see him," he said. "He's been there since you went in." 40 minutes. "Yeah." She wrote it in the notebook while Frank drove. That evening, Valentino called. She had been expecting him to, and the anticipation of it had been a specific kind of tension all day. Not fear, not dread, but the braced readiness of someone waiting for a physical impact they know is coming. She answered on the third ring. "Elena." His voice was different. She noticed immediately. The control was still there. It was always there. It was architectural in him, built into the structure. But something underneath it was strained in a way she had never heard before. He sounded like a man holding a very heavy thing and trying not to let the effort show in his breathing. "Valentino, I need you to listen to me." "I'm listening." "This has gone beyond—" He stopped. She heard him breathe. "What you did with those documents, who you gave them to. You understand what that means. You understand what you've put in motion." "I do," she said. "Elena." His voice dropped. "I have people, not my people. People above my operation, who are making it very clear to me that the exposure you've created is not something I can contain. If the federal investigation proceeds, it's going to proceed," she said. "It's already proceeding." A pause. When he spoke again, there was something in his voice she had never heard in 7 years and could not immediately name. Something raw and unguarded that existed briefly before the control came down over it again. "You're going to destroy everything." "You destroyed everything," she said. "On Thanksgiving. You destroyed it the 8 months before that. I'm just the one who decided to stop pretending it wasn't destroyed." "Our son." "Don't." Her voice came out sharp, sharper than she intended, the first real crack in the steadiness she had been maintaining all day, and she stopped and breathed before she continued. "Do not use our son as a point in this argument. Our son is the reason I am doing every single thing I am doing. Our son is the reason I did not stay in that penthouse and wait for you to decide to end it after he was born and restructure his childhood around your convenience." Silence. "I want to see you," he said, "in person, not with lawyers." "No." "Elena?" "Valentino, listen to me very carefully." She stood up and walked to the window, the same window she always walked to when she needed the city below her as a kind of witness. "The next time we speak in person will be in front of attorneys and a judge. That is how this works now. Whatever you need to say to me, you say it through Celeste's office. If you continue to have people follow me, I will add that to the existing documentation of harassment. If you make any further contact with my employer or any of my professional relationships, I will file an additional motion. If anyone knocks on my door in the night, I will call the police and I will call the federal attorney's office and I will call every contact in Celeste's Rolodex simultaneously." She paused. "I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you the procedure because you need to understand that I have a procedure and I am not going to deviate from it." She hung up. She stood at the window for a moment. Her heart was going fast. She pressed her palm flat against the glass, which was cold, and felt the cold move up through her hand and her wrist, and she breathed with it. Then her phone rang again. Not Valentino. Celeste. "Are you near a television or a computer?" Celeste said. "Why?" "Turn on the news." She crossed to her laptop and opened a news browser, and the top item loaded before she had fully registered what she was looking at. The headline was in large text. "Federal agents execute search warrants at multiple locations connected to Moretti Financial Holdings." Below it, a photo of a building she recognized, the office on the west side of Manhattan, the one with the Moretti-adjacent accounting firm on the 3rd floor, The one Dana Rice had been quietly examining for 3 weeks. There were 2 other locations listed. One of them was a residential address on the Upper East Side, Vivian's address. They moved fast, Elena said. Faster than I expected, Celeste said. This is good for you. This is the investigation establishing itself publicly before Valentino's attorneys can file those emergency motions. It changes the order of things significantly. A pause. Elena, I need to tell you something else. I got a call an hour ago from Gerald Park's office. The attorney who retained Dana Rice. Yes, apparently Valentino's people made contact with Park today. They were asking about the source of the leak, how the financial documents got outside the organization, who Dana had spoken to. Celeste's voice was precise. Park's people held the line, but Valentino's going to know it was Dana who talked, and he's going to know Dana talked to you, and I don't know yet what he does with that. Elena sat down. Is Dana safe? Park's handling that. Celeste, is she safe? A pause. I believe so. She took precautions, but I want you to be aware that Valentino is now actively looking for the chain of information that led to the federal filing, and your name is at a node in that chain. My name has been at a node in this chain since I handed you those documents, Elena said. Yes, Celeste said, but there's a difference between him knowing abstractly that you acted and him knowing the specific mechanics of how. The mechanics give him something to focus on. Anger needs a target, Elena. I want you to be careful in the next 72 hours. I'm always careful. Be more careful, Celeste said. She was. She rearranged her schedule. She stopped going out alone. She had Frank drive her everywhere, and she had Celeste's paralegal, a young woman named Sue who turned out to have a background in personal security that Elena had not known about, and that Celeste mentioned with a notable absence of detail. Come and stay in the second bedroom. She did all of this quietly, without drama, and she kept writing in her notebook. The emergency custody motion arrived on Wednesday. It was 43 pages. She sat in Celeste's office and read all 43 of them in just under 2 hours while Celeste worked at her desk, and the paralegal brought coffee that Elena didn't drink. The motion alleged that Elena was in a mentally and emotionally compromised state due to the stress of the divorce proceedings. It cited her elevated blood pressure as evidence of physical instability. It cited her connection to federal investigators, framed as active cooperation that constituted deliberate hostile action against the father of her unborn child, as evidence of adversarial behavior that would damage the child's relationship with his father. It used language like reckless, like demonstrably destabilizing, like willful obstruction of paternal rights. Elena, all of it. When she finished, she set the pages down on the edge of Celeste's desk and sat back in her chair. How do we answer it? She said. Celeste turned from her computer. She was a woman in her late 50s with the particular kind of face that had stopped trying to look younger than it was, and had arrived at something better. Direct, attentive, entirely unimpressed by drama. She had been practicing family law for 28 years. She looked at the motion and at Elena and said, We answer it with your log. The log went into a counterfiling the next morning. 61 entries. Dates, times, descriptions, photographs of the black car, the record of the Nico encounter, the timestamps on the surveillance subpoena, Frank's written account of the man outside the OBGYN building. Elena's medical records showing that her blood pressure had been elevated before the divorce filing and was being monitored and was not classified as a crisis by her physician. A letter from her doctor stating that Elena Moretti was managing a normal high-risk pregnancy responsibly and was not medically compromised in any way relevant to custody. And at the back of the counterfiling, 3 pages that Celeste had prepared specifically, precisely, and with a quality of quiet devastation that Elena had not anticipated. A timeline, starting 14 months ago. VH Advisory Group Incorporation date, first fund transfer, the progression of transactions, Vivian's signatures, Valentino's connection to the originating accounts. All of it laid out in sequential order like a staircase that went only one direction. Are we allowed to include this? Elena asked. In a custody filing, I can argue it's directly relevant to the financial stability and character of the petitioning parent, Celeste said. Yes, we're allowed. The counterfiling landed in the judge's office on Thursday afternoon. On Friday morning, Elena's phone rang at 6:48. She was awake. She had been awake since 5, which was becoming normal, the baby pressing in ways that made sleep increasingly theoretical. And she picked up without looking at the number, which was something she had stopped doing months ago, and which she allowed herself now because Sue was in the next room, and Frank was downstairs, and the parallelogram of security she had built around herself was functioning. It was Vivian. Her voice, when she spoke, was stripped of every layer Elena had known. No warmth, no texture, no practiced quality. Just a woman's voice at 6:48 in the morning, flat and frightened and bare. "They were here last night," she said. Elena sat up. "Federal agents?" "No." A breath. "Valentino's people, 2 men. They didn't do anything. They just came to the door and they stood there, and one of them said that Valentino wanted me to know he was disappointed in how things had developed." Another breath, shorter. "Elena, they know I warned you. About him knowing. They know I texted you." Elena's jaw tightened. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. I'm scared. I'm scared, and I have a meeting with my attorney in 3 hours, and I don't know what to—" Vivian's voice broke. Not dramatically, not the way voices broke in performed distress. It broke the way a voice breaks when someone is genuinely at the end of what they can hold. "I thought he loved me," she said. "I know how that sounds. I know what I did, and I know how it sounds. But I thought—" "I know what you thought," Elena said. Silence. "He used me," Vivian said. Not like a discovery, like a fact she was finally allowing herself to say out loud. "Yes," Elena said. "He did." "What do I do?" "You go to your attorney," Elena said. "You tell your attorney everything. Everything you know about the accounts. Everything he told you about the structure. Every conversation you can remember. You write it down before you go so you don't forget anything. And then you let your attorney decide the best way to use it." "Will it help me? If I cooperate?" "I don't know," Elena said. "I can't promise you that, but it's the only move you have." After she hung up, she sat on the edge of the bed with both feet on the floor and her hands in her lap and thought for a moment about the strange geometry of it. The 3 of them, herself and Valentino and Vivian, the shape they had made without intending to, the damage distributed unevenly, and in ways none of them had fully anticipated. She did not feel sorry for Vivian in a simple way. She felt something more complicated, something that acknowledged Vivian's choices and their consequences, and also acknowledged the mechanics of a man who identified what people wanted and gave them just enough of it to make them useful. She picked up her notebook. She opened it. She wrote, "VH called." 6:48 a.m. Valentino sent men to her apartment. She's cooperating with her attorney. She underlined the last sentence. The hearing was set for the following Wednesday. Celeste had moved fast to get it scheduled. The emergency custody motion required a response hearing, and Celeste had pushed for the earliest available date, knowing that time was the variable Valentino was trying to manipulate. The longer the motion sat, the more space it created for additional filings, additional noise, additional pressure on Elena's stability in the weeks before she gave birth. Wednesday, 5 days. Elena spent those 5 days in a state of focused preparation that she recognized, abstractly, as her own version of what Valentino did before significant meetings. The information gathering, the sequencing, the identification of weak points in the opposing position. She had learned it from watching him, and she was using it now in a way he had not anticipated because he had looked at her for 7 years and seen the woman who lit candles and made dinner and had not thought to consider what she had absorbed simply by being present. The night before the hearing, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark with her hand on her stomach and her mind cycling through the counterfiling and Celeste's strategy and the timeline document and Vivian's voice at 6:48 in the morning and the number 4.3 million and the words after the baby is born in Valentino's hotel room voice. And she cycled through all of it until the cycling slowed down and became something quieter, something that wasn't peace but was adjacent to resolution. She had done everything she could do. Everything that remained was the doing of it. At 4 in the morning, she got up and made tea and sat at the kitchen table and wrote in her notebook. Not the log this time, not dated entries and documented incidents, just writing, the kind she hadn't done since before all of this, since before the earbuds on the counter and the Thanksgiving table and the papers beside the fork. She wrote for 40 minutes, and when she stopped, she read what she had written and closed the notebook and went back to bed and slept until 7. The courtroom was smaller than she had expected. She didn't know what she'd expected, something grander, perhaps, more commensurate with the weight of what was happening inside it. Instead, it was an ordinary room with cream walls and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell, and a judge named Miriam Taft, who was 61 years old and had presided over family court in Manhattan for 19 years, and who had, Celeste informed her quietly before they went in, a specific and documented impatience for men who filed emergency motions designed to pressure pregnant women. Valentino was already there when they arrived. He was in a dark suit, no tie, with two attorneys on either side of him. Not the divorce attorneys, different ones, the ones who handled his business interests. And he looked, Elena thought, like a man who had not slept adequately in several weeks but was applying an enormous amount of effort to the project of not showing it. He looked at her when she walked in, and she looked back at him, and neither of them looked away first, and neither of them looked away second, because the moment simply passed into something else, into the procedural reality of the room, and they both turned toward the front. Judge Taft came in at 9:03. She was a compact woman with silver hair cut close to her head, and reading glasses she took off and put back on with the practiced regularity of someone who had stopped caring about the affectation of it. She had already read both the motion and the counterfiling. Elena could tell because she looked at the documents in front of her with the specific lack of surprise of a reader revisiting material rather than encountering it. "Before we proceed," Judge Taft said, in a voice that had the economy of someone who had said important things in rooms for 19 years and had stopped wasting words on anything that wasn't important, "I want to address the nature of this motion." She looked at Valentino's attorneys. "Counselors, this court received a 43-page emergency custody filing citing the respondent's blood pressure and her cooperation with federal investigators as evidence of instability. The counterfiling received yesterday includes 61 logged incidents of surveillance, intimidation, and interference with the respondent's employment." She paused. "I have some questions about which party is destabilizing which." Valentino's lead attorney, a man named Horace Webb, who charged the kind of hourly rate that assumed the client had already decided the outcome, stood up smoothly. "Your Honor, the petitioner." "Sit down, Mr. Webb," Judge Taft said. Not unkindly, just precisely. "I'll get to you." She looked at Celeste. She looked at Elena. "How far along are you?" she said. 8.5 months, Elena said. Judge Taft nodded once and wrote something. What happened in the next 4 hours was not, Elena would think later, anything like what she had seen in films or television. The dramatic revelations, the gasps, the slamming gavels. It was quieter than that, more granular, more exhausting. It was Celeste presenting the log, entry by entry, specific and documented and dry. It was Horace Webb arguing procedural objections that Judge Taft sustained some of and dismissed more of. It was the timeline document going into evidence despite Webb's arguments because Celeste had prepared it carefully enough that the legal basis was sound. It was Elena sitting at a table and answering questions put to her by both sides with the flat precision she had been practicing, not embellishing, not dramatizing, not giving the opposing attorneys anything shapeable. It was Valentino's attorneys arguing that cooperation with a federal investigation constituted hostile action, and Judge Taft looking at them over her glasses with an expression that stopped just short of something, and saying, "Counselors, cooperation with lawfully executed federal process is not a tort. Move on." At 1:15 there was a recess. Elena went to the bathroom and stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrists and looked at herself in the mirror. Her face was pale under the fluorescent light, and her back hurt in the grinding, specific way it had been hurting for 6 weeks. And she was tired in a way that was different from regular tired, that went down into a level she didn't have a good word for. But she was still standing. Celeste came in behind her. "You're doing well," she said. "What's he doing out there?" "Webb is on his phone." Celeste leaned against the wall. They didn't expect the timeline document. They thought the financial evidence had been sealed pending the federal investigation. They're recalibrating. What does that mean for the afternoon? It means Webb is going to go harder on the character arguments. They have nothing else. Celeste looked at her directly. "Elena, when they come at you this afternoon, and they will, I need you to remember that the goal is not to win the argument. The goal is to be exactly who you've been all day. Consistent, documented, calm. You don't have to defend yourself against anything they say. You just have to be yourself in the room." Elena looked at her in the mirror. "I know how to be myself," she said. I know you do, Celeste said. I'm just reminding you that it's enough. They went back in. The afternoon was harder. Webb was methodical and skilled, and he came at Elena's choices with a precision that was designed not to land any single decisive blow, but to accumulate the elevated blood pressure, the fact that she had withheld financial documents from disclosure, the cooperation with outside investigators, the decision to have a non-family member stay in the apartment, the decision to hire a private driver, all of it framed as evidence of a pattern of decision-making that was erratic and increasingly detached from the practical realities of preparing for a child. Elena answered each question. She answered them completely, and she answered them without visible anger, and she answered them without crying, and she answered them without the particular kind of defensive urgency that jurors and judges read as either guilt or instability, because she had spent 3 weeks preparing for exactly this, because Celeste had run her through variations of every question Webb was currently asking, because she had done her homework. Valentino watched her from across the room. She could feel him watching. She had always been able to feel when his attention was on her, even in the early years when that attention had meant something different, had been something she wanted. She felt it now as a kind of pressure, steady and assessing, and she did not look at him. At 3:47, Webb asked, Mrs. Moretti, do you believe that your unilateral decision to provide sensitive financial information to federal investigators, without consulting your husband or your own legal counsel first, was a responsible act for a woman in your condition? There was a pause. Elena looked at him. I consulted my legal counsel, she said. I did not consult my husband because the documents in question related to financial crimes in which he was the principal actor. She paused. As for my condition, I'm pregnant, Mr. Webb. I'm not incapacitated. Women make significant decisions while pregnant. It's quite common. Something happened in the room. Not a sound exactly, more like a shift in the quality of the silence. Judge Taft made a note. And it was at that moment, 4:02 in the afternoon, with the fluorescent lights humming and her back aching and her son pressing against her ribs in a way that had started 40 minutes ago and had not stopped, that Elena saw it happen to Valentino Moretti for the first time in 7 years of marriage. She had turned to reach for her water glass, and she caught him in her peripheral vision, and she saw it, just briefly, just for a moment before the control came back down. The thing underneath the machine, raw and exposed, the look of a man who has just understood, not intellectually but viscerally, in the body, what it means to lose. Not the case, not the motion. Her. The full understanding of it, arriving at 4:02 in the afternoon in a cream-walled family courtroom under fluorescent lights, that she was gone. Not angry, not temporarily estranged, not renegotiable, gone, decided, irrecoverable, and that everything he had deployed in the past 3 weeks, the surveillance and the pressure and the emergency motion and Horace Webb and all of it, had not moved her a single degree. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Then his face closed again and he was looking at the table. But she had seen it. Judge Taft called the session to a close at 4:15 and announced she would deliver her ruling the following morning. Elena walked out of the courtroom with Celeste beside her, and Sue a step behind, and she did not look back. In the elevator, Celeste said, "Tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock." Elena nodded. "Whatever she rules," Celeste said, "we have grounds for the next step in either direction. You understand that?" "I understand," Elena said. The elevator opened. They walked through the lobby and out through the heavy doors and into the cold November air, and Elena stopped on the top step and breathed it in, cold and exhaust, and the particular New York smell of a city that was always in the middle of something and didn't stop for anyone's crisis. She breathed it in and she breathed it out. Tomorrow, Miriam Taft would sit at her bench at 9 o'clock in the morning and read a ruling that would determine what happened next to Elena Moretti and her unborn son and the wreckage of a marriage and an empire that had been coming apart for longer than any of them had admitted. And Valentino Moretti, somewhere across this city tonight, was sitting with the knowledge that he had built his entire life on the assumption that he would always be the most powerful person in any room he entered. He had not accounted for the room being a courtroom. He had not accounted for 61 logged entries in a plain notebook from a pharmacy. He had not accounted for the woman who had spent 7 years watching how he operated, absorbing every strategy, every tactic, every method, and who had been quietly building the case of her own life while he was looking somewhere else. Tomorrow at 9 o'clock, the accounting would begin. She didn't sleep much that night. Not because she was afraid, The fear had transmuted somewhere over the past 3 weeks into something else, something denser and less volatile that she didn't have an exact word for, but that felt, when she pressed against it, like bedrock. Not comfort, not certainty, just the solid fact of having already survived the worst of it and still being upright. She lay in the dark and listened to the city and felt her son move and thought about 9 o'clock in the morning. At 6, she got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and opened her notebook to a blank page and wrote nothing. She just sat with the open page for a while, the pen in her hand, the steam rising from the cup, the early gray light coming through the windows. Then she closed the notebook and got dressed with the particular care of someone who understands that the way you present yourself in a room where important things are decided is itself a form of argument. She wore the navy dress. It was the one that still fit cleanly at 8.5 months. The one that made her look, she thought, like someone who had not been broken by the last several weeks. Not because she was pretending she hadn't been marked by them, but because the marks had settled into her differently than breaking, had become something more like grain in wood, something that showed without weakening. Sue drove her to the courthouse. Frank sat in the front. Nobody talked. The courtroom at 8:55 was the same room it had been the day before. Same cream walls, same fluorescent hum, same quality of institutional air that had absorbed the residue of too many hard mornings. Valentino was already there. Same dark suit, different tie, blue this time, which was a small detail she noted without meaning to. The way you note small things about people you've known for years because the notation has become automatic, has outlasted the significance it once carried. He looked at her when she walked in. She sat down. Judge Taft came in at 9:03, the same as the day before, and the room stood and sat and settled into the specific held breath quality of people waiting for a verdict. The judge set her papers on the bench. She put her reading glasses on. She took them off. She looked at the room. "I'm going to be direct," she said, "because I think that serves everyone better than formality in this instance, and because I have read both filings thoroughly and I have some things to say before I deliver the ruling." She looked at Valentino's side of the room. The petitioner filed an emergency motion citing his wife's cooperation with federal investigators and her elevated blood pressure as evidence of maternal instability, Judge Taft said. "I want to be clear that I find both of these arguments not merely unpersuasive, but troubling in their framing. A woman who provides legally obtained documents to federal authorities is exercising a civic right. A woman whose blood pressure is elevated during a high-risk pregnancy that is being managed by a licensed obstetrician is not medically compromised in any way this court recognizes as relevant to custody." She paused. "What is relevant is the counterfiling, which documents 61 separate incidents of surveillance, professional interference, and intimidation directed at the respondent over a period of less than 4 weeks. Horace Webb began to rise. "Mr. Webb," Judge Taft said, without looking at him, "if you stand up before I finish, I'm going to interpret that as a significant miscalculation of this room." Webb sat down. "The counterfiling also includes a financial timeline document," Judge Taft continued, "which this court has reviewed and has referred to the appropriate federal authority, given that it touches on matters already under active investigation. This court does not adjudicate federal financial crimes, but this court does consider the character and conduct of a petitioning parent, and the conduct documented in both that timeline and in the 61 logged incidents constitutes a pattern of behavior that this court takes with the utmost seriousness." She finally put her glasses on and looked at her papers. "The emergency custody motion is denied. The petitioner's request for sole custody pending birth is denied. The court orders that any contact between the petitioner and the respondent occur exclusively through legal counsel until further hearing. The court further orders that any surveillance, direct or indirect, of the respondent's person, residence, or daily movements cease immediately and completely, and that violation of this order will be treated as contempt." She looked up. "We will schedule a full custody hearing for 60 days post-birth, at which point both parties will have the opportunity to present comprehensive arguments. In the interim, the respondent retains full decision-making authority regarding her medical care and place of residence." She took her glasses off. "That's my ruling," she said. "We're adjourned." The gavel came down once, clean and final, and the sound of it moved through the room, and Elena felt it in her sternum, felt it land and resonate there briefly, and then go still. Celeste's hand covered hers on the table, a brief pressure, professional and warm at the same time. "Okay," Celeste said quietly. Okay. Elena nodded. She looked at the table for a moment, then she looked up. Across the room, Valentino was standing. His attorneys were speaking to him. Webb's mouth was moving, something low and rapid. But Valentino wasn't listening. He was looking at Elena. Not with the controlled assessment she had seen yesterday or the cold calculation of the past weeks. He was looking at her the way you look at something when you finally understand that it is completely and permanently beyond your reach, and the understanding has arrived not as a concept but as a physical fact that sits in the chest. She looked back at him. She thought about 9 years. She thought about the man she had believed he was, and the man he actually was, and the space between those two things, which had been the territory she had lived in for most of their marriage without knowing it. She thought about the earbuds on the kitchen counter, and the champagne, and the hotel suite, and the words he had said in the voice she'd never heard before. She didn't feel sorry for him. She didn't feel triumphant either. She felt, when she examined it honestly, something closer to tired. The specific tiredness of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has finally been allowed to set it down. Not relief exactly. More like the quiet that arrives after a long noise stops. She picked up her bag. She stood up. She walked out of the room. In the corridor, she stopped and put one hand against the wall and breathed. Celeste came out behind her. "Don't stop yet," she said, not unkindly. "Let's get you outside first." They walked to the elevator. They rode it down. They came out through the lobby and through the heavy doors and into the cold, and Elena stopped on the top step exactly as she had done the day before and breathed the city air and felt the cold move through her and felt her son move in response to it, that slow rolling pressure that meant he was awake and attending to whatever information the world was sending him through the medium of her body. "What happens now?" she said. "Now," Celeste said, "we go back to the office, we document today's ruling, and we begin preparing for the custody hearing in 60 days. She paused. "And you go home and eat something and sleep." "And Valentino?" Celeste was quiet for a moment. "His attorneys will file something, they always do. But today was a significant loss for him, and the financial investigation is going to occupy an increasing amount of his resources and attention in the coming weeks." She looked at Elena directly. "He's not going to stop entirely. Men like him don't just stop. But the terrain has shifted. He has less ground to operate from." Elena nodded. She got in the car. 3 days later, Vivian Hale's attorney contacted the federal investigators and offered full cooperation in exchange for a negotiated resolution. Vivian provided everything: account records, email communications, the specific conversations in which Valentino had explained the structure to her, the dates and amounts of every signature she had provided, and what he had told her it was for. She provided it all in a 14-hour deposition that her attorney described, later, to a colleague, as the most comprehensive accounting of willful self-deception in service of romantic delusion he had personally witnessed in 20 years of practice. Elena heard about it through Celeste. She sat with the information for a day before she decided how she felt about it, which was complicated. Not forgiving, she had told Vivian honestly that forgiveness was not something she had arrived at, and that remained true. But not without a kind of grim comprehension either. Vivian had wanted something specific from Valentino and had allowed that wanting to take up more space than her own judgment, and Elena understood the mechanics of that better than she would have liked, because she had done a version of it herself for 7 years, in a different way, with different stakes, but the same basic architecture. Wanting a thing to be true badly enough that you arrange your understanding of the evidence to support it. She didn't call Vivian, but she didn't delete her number from her phone either. She wasn't sure yet what that meant. She thought it might not mean anything specific. Might just be the human inability to cleanly close the door on 12 years, even 12 years that had ended the way these had. She let it sit without resolving it. On a Thursday in late December, 3 weeks before her due date, Elena packed the last of the things she was taking from the penthouse. She had been preparing for this for 2 weeks. Not urgently, not dramatically, but steadily, in the quiet, methodical way she had been doing most things since Thanksgiving. She had found an apartment in Brooklyn, on a tree-lined street in a neighborhood that was calm without being remote, close enough to Manhattan that she wasn't exiled from her life, but far enough that it felt genuinely different. The apartment was the top floor of a brownstone. It had good light in the mornings, and a small room she had already painted a soft, warm gray for the baby, and a kitchen that faced south and a front door that was hers alone. She took very little from the penthouse: clothes, books, the kitchen tools she had brought from her apartment before the marriage, the photographs from her childhood and her years before Valentino, the earlier geography of her life that had existed before she had reorganized it around him. The plain notebook, full now, that she put in the bottom of a bag wrapped in a cotton scarf. She left the art they had chosen together, the furniture, the expensive kitchen equipment they had bought at a store in Tribeca on a Saturday morning years ago when they were happy, or when she had believed they were happy, which was not exactly the same thing but which she had not been able to distinguish at the time. She left the walnut dining table. She stood in front of it for a moment before she left, the table that had been meant for two and had been set with such care on Thanksgiving Eve, and had held a manila envelope beside an empty fork. She stood in front of it and she put her hand on the surface, on the wood that was solid and heavy and exactly as permanent as it had always been, and she thought, this was where it ended, this specific surface, this specific night, the candles and the cooling food and the silence. She lifted her hand. She picked up her bag. She left. The baby came on a Tuesday in January. 18 hours of labor, which her doctor told her was well within normal range for a first delivery, and which Elena, during approximately hour 14, found she disagreed with profoundly. She had Celeste there, which was an unusual choice, and which Celeste had accepted with the same direct warmth she applied to everything, and she had a friend from before the marriage, a woman named Ruth, who had known her since college, and who held her hand for 6 of the 18 hours and said very little, which was exactly what Elena needed. She did not call Valentino. She had thought about this. She had thought about it carefully and without the fog of anger, because she wanted to make decisions in the clear air rather than in reaction to anything, and she had concluded that there was no version of calling Valentino in which his presence in that room served her son rather than the complicated machinery of their history, and that the first hours of her son's life were not the place for that machinery. He would be part of his son's life. That was the law, and it was also, she had decided, the right thing. Not for Valentino's sake, not for the mythology of fatherhood, but because her son deserved to have access to all of who he came from and to form his own understanding of it. That was a decision she had made sober and clear-eyed, and she intended to hold it. But the first hours were hers. The baby was born at 4:47 in the morning. He was 7 pounds and 2 ounces, and he had a quantity of dark hair that surprised everyone in the room, including Elena. And when they placed him on her chest, he was warm and improbably real, and his eyes were open, and he looked at her with the unfocused ancient attention of someone arriving in a place they have no context for yet, and finding it, against all evidence, acceptable. She held him. She had thought she would cry, and she didn't, or not immediately. What she felt instead was something larger than crying, something that didn't fit inside the usual dimensions of emotion, that pressed against the inside of her chest from a direction she hadn't known feelings could come from. "Hi," she said, quietly, because the room was quiet. "Hi. I know you." She had known him for 9 months. She had talked to him in kitchens and bathrooms and courtrooms, had carried him through the worst of it and the steadiest of it, had felt him move when she was frightened and when she was tired, and on one specific Tuesday morning when she had just hung up from a call with Celeste, and stood at the window with the city below her and felt, for a brief moment, something that was as close to certainty as she had felt in years. She held him, and she looked at him, and the world outside the window was still dark, and she was 34 years old and tired in a way she had never been, and more present than she had ever been simultaneously. And it was, she thought, exactly right. She named him Marco, not for Valentino's consigliere, but for her grandfather, her mother's father, a man who had worked hard all his life and laughed easily and died with his hands folded and the people he loved around him, which was the life she intended for her son. She called him Marco, and he made a small sound against her chest. Valentino found out through Celeste's office, per the agreement they had reached. His response, relayed through his attorney, was a formal acknowledgement and a statement that he intended to be present at the 60-day custody hearing. There were no additional messages, no flowers, no calls. She didn't know if that was restraint or strategy or something else entirely, and she had reached the point where she recognized that she would probably never know, and that the not knowing was simply a permanent condition of having been married to Valentino Moretti, which was itself a condition she was working daily to move fully into the past tense. She left the hospital on Thursday. Ruth drove her to Brooklyn. The brownstone was warm when she came in. She had left the heat on, had thought about that specifically before she left. And there was something about coming home to a warm apartment that was its own small form of competence, of having arranged things for herself. She stood in the doorway for a moment with Marco in the carrier against her chest, and looked at the hallway and the kitchen light and the southern windows she had not yet fully put her mark on. It was hers. Completely and solely hers. She went inside. The custody hearing happened 63 days later, on a morning in March when the city had begun its annual reluctant negotiation with the idea of spring. It was not the dramatic confrontation she had braced for. It was, in fact, considerably more muted than either the emergency motion hearing or the weeks leading up to it, which Celeste had told her was common, that the volume tended to drain from proceedings once the fundamental decisions had been made, once both parties had absorbed what the situation actually was, rather than what they had each hoped it might be. Valentino came in with one attorney, not two. He looked different. She noticed this before she noticed anything else. Not diminished exactly, but altered, the way places look when you return to them after a long absence, and the physical facts are the same, but the meaning you once attached to them has relocated. He looked like a man who had been through something that had cost him, and she supposed that was accurate, was in fact the most accurate description of the past months for both of them. He did not look at her the same way. The assessment was still there. It was probably always going to be there. It was built too deep to remove. But the thing underneath it, the property, the ownership, the fundamental assumption that she was something he had to manage and could eventually reclaim, was gone. She could see the absence of it the same way she had seen the 2 seconds of its dissolution in the courtroom in November, except that now the absence was complete and settled. Judge Taft was not presiding over this hearing. It was a different judge, a man named Delgado, who was methodical and fair, and who had clearly read the prior proceedings thoroughly. The arrangement they arrived at, after 4 hours of negotiation that happened partly in the room and partly in a side corridor between attorneys, was not simple, but it was workable. Shared legal custody, with Elena as primary residential parent, Valentino's visitation structured and supervised for the first year, given the documented concerns, moving to unsupervised if the reviews went cleanly. A financial arrangement that was equitable and that reflected, among other things, the legal costs Elena had incurred managing what the filing described neutrally as the circumstances of the separation. There was a line in the final agreement about the federal investigation, a single sentence, placed there by Celeste, with the precision of someone who had thought carefully about what needed to exist in writing. Both parties acknowledge that matters currently under separate federal jurisdiction are not resolved by this agreement and remain independent of its terms. It was a legal formality. It was also the acknowledgement, in official language, that Valentino's situation extended considerably beyond a divorce proceeding and that Elena was not responsible for managing it. She signed the agreement. He signed it too. She did not look at him while he signed it. She looked at the table, at the surface of the table, at the legal document, and then at her own signature on it, and she thought about all the surfaces she had looked at over the past months. The kitchen counter, the Thanksgiving table, the courtroom bench, the sink in the bathroom where she had run cold water over her wrists more times than she had counted. All of them were just surfaces, neutral objects. It was what happened above them that mattered. She picked up her pen. She put it in her bag. She stood up. Outside in the corridor, Valentino's attorney went ahead toward the elevator, and Valentino stopped walking and turned. And Elena stopped walking because she felt him stop, felt the shift in the air, the way you feel a change in weather before the weather fully arrives. They stood in the corridor. Around them, the building made its sounds. A distant phone, footsteps on a different floor, the particular hum of a large institutional space in mid-morning motion. "He's healthy?" Valentino said. "He's healthy," she said. A pause. "What does he look like?" She had not expected that question in that particular voice. She had expected many things from Valentino and had prepared for them with care, but the specific quality of that question, stripped of everything else, just a man asking what his son looked like, was not one of the things she had prepared for. "He looks like you," she said. "He has your hair." Valentino looked at the floor. Something moved across his face that she didn't try to interpret, that she allowed to exist without analysis, because she was done interpreting Valentino Moretti, and what she allowed herself to see in him was her business, not his material. "I'm sorry," he said. She looked at him. "I know," she said. I believe you mean that. But it doesn't. No, she said. It doesn't. He nodded once. She walked to the elevator. She did not look back. She had spent 9 years turning to look back at Valentino Moretti, at what he was doing, at what he meant, at whether he was turning toward her or away from her. She had spent 9 years calibrating her understanding of herself against the reading she took from his face. She pressed the elevator button. She thought about Marco, who was with Ruth this morning and who had, in the 63 days of his existence, begun to look at things, really look at them, with the focused, slightly frowning attention of someone for whom the entire world is new information and all of it is potentially significant. He looked at lights and hands and faces with equal seriousness, and he had recently begun, in the mornings, to look at Elena with what she could only describe as recognition, the expression of someone who knows, in whatever pre-linguistic way knowing works at 8 weeks old, that this is the specific face that means safety, that means continuation, that means home. She thought about that look. The elevator opened. She got in. 6 months later, on a late afternoon in July, when the city was hot and thick with summer, and the park was full of people who had decided that Tuesday afternoon was close enough to the weekend to justify being outside, Elena sat on a bench in Central Park with Marco in her arms and watched the light move through the leaves the way it moves in summer, restless and particular, always finding new angles. He was 26 pounds now and deeply serious about his physical world. He was at the stage of reaching for everything, of examining objects with intense manual focus, of becoming aware that the world extended beyond his immediate field of vision and that something interesting might exist just past the edge of whatever he was currently looking at. He reached now for a leaf that had drifted down from the tree above them and caught it between both palms and looked at it with the frowning concentration that made Elena think, every time, of a very small scientist encountering a promising but confusing piece of data. She watched him examine the leaf. She thought about Thanksgiving. Not with pain. The pain had changed its address somewhere over the past months, had moved from the foreground to somewhere further back, something she passed through occasionally rather than lived inside. She thought about it the way you think about the worst storm you've ever been caught in. The specific details still vivid, the fear still real when you remembered it, but the present moment so much larger than the memory that the memory had found its correct proportion. She thought about the candles and the table and the empty chair. She thought about the earbuds in her palm and the amber light blinking and the decision that took maybe 3 seconds and changed everything. She thought about the woman who had made that decision, the one who had run cold water over her wrists and looked in the mirror and picked up a notebook from a pharmacy and started writing things down. And she felt toward that woman something she had not felt toward herself in a long time, which was uncomplicated respect. Not because that woman had done everything right. She hadn't. Elena could see now, from the distance of months, the places where she had been too proud or too afraid or too slow to ask for help. The decisions that had been based more on the need to prove something than on actual judgment. She had not been perfect in any of this. The process had cost her more than she had admitted to anyone, and some of what it had cost her she wasn't sure she'd fully reclaimed yet. But she had not broken. She had not been managed out of her own story. She had stood in every room she needed to stand in and said what she needed to say, and written what she needed to write, and signed what she needed to sign. And on the other side of all of that was this bench in July, and this baby examining this leaf and this life, which was smaller than the one she had left, and quieter and more entirely hers than anything she had ever owned. The Moretti investigation remained ongoing. She read about it occasionally, in the spare functional way she allowed herself to engage with news that was adjacent to her life without being inside it anymore. 2 of the financial officers had entered plea agreements. One of the senior captains had testified in a separate proceeding. Valentino himself had not been indicted. Not yet. His attorneys had been thorough and the structures were complex. But the investigation had contracted his world significantly, had cost him allies and assets, and the particular currency of invincibility that had been, she understood now, the thing he valued most, the thing no amount of legal or financial trouble could fully restore once it was gone. She didn't feel satisfied by this. She had thought she might, and she didn't. It simply existed, the way a weather report exists. Information about conditions, neither good nor bad from a distance. Vivian's situation had resolved to a consent agreement and a substantial financial penalty, and the end of her career in the city, which was its own particular consequence. She had moved. Elena had heard this from Ruth, who had heard it from someone else. The information traveling through the network of mutual acquaintances the way information always does, finding its way to the people who needed it with the imperfect accuracy of rumor. Somewhere quieter, somewhere smaller. Elena thought about this sometimes, not with satisfaction or with grief, but with the complex recognition of what it meant to have organized your ambitions around a version of another person's life, and then to have the architecture collapse. She had not reached out to Vivian. She thought she might, eventually. Not yet. Marco dropped the leaf. He watched it fall with an expression of genuine scientific interest. Then he looked at Elena and made a sound that was not yet a word but had the quality of one, had the intentionality of one, had the particular shape of something that meant, "Did you see that? Are you paying attention?" "I saw," she said. He looked back at where the leaf had landed. She pulled him slightly closer, and he permitted this with the benevolent distraction of someone who has already moved on to the next piece of data, the next thing to examine, the next question the world was presenting. She sat on the bench in the July afternoon and held her son and let the light move through the trees, and she did not have a grand thought or a final reckoning or any particular language for what she had come through, because the truth of it was that the language was insufficient, and she had stopped needing language for it. She was here. He was here. That was the whole of it. And on the other side of every table she had cleared, and every candle she had blown out, and every cold morning she had run cold water over her wrists and made herself look in the mirror and kept going. On the other side of the court, filing and the notebook and the elevator and the courthouse corridor and the corridor itself and the long specific cost of refusing to be managed out of her own life. On the other side of all of it was this bench, this afternoon, this child, this quiet, the same holiday that had once marked the night. Everything fell apart had become, in the reckoning she had slowly arrived at, the first night of something else. Not the end of her marriage, not the beginning of a legal battle, but the first night she had stopped performing the story she was supposed to be living and started living the one that was actually hers. She had whispered Happy Thanksgiving to an empty room. She had meant it as a farewell. She understood now that it had been the first sentence of something much longer, something still being written, something she intended to keep writing in the careful, deliberate way she had learned to write everything that mattered, one day at a time, eyes open, nothing omitted, nothing softened into something it wasn't. Marco turned in her arms and looked up at her face and found there whatever it was he was looking for and returned his attention to the world. She held him. The afternoon light moved and shifted, and the park breathed around them, and the city continued its endless, unpausing motion beyond the tree line, and Elena Moretti sat in the middle of all of it, in the quiet at the center of her own life, and breathed.